The last video covered working in context in an assembly, and it covered the specifics behind how those parts update and how different components interact. In this one, we'll take this simple engine block and build a piston, a rod, and a crankshaft, and mate those all up and have that interacting. So the first thing I'll do is create a new assembly. And generally I'll click on the feature manager and click on the origin to add this in so that it's fixed at the origin. And if you set up your planes on your part in the same manner, then all of these will generally line up. The first thing I'm going to do is save out the assembly. I'll call this engine. And the reason I save it out is we're going to create in-context relations and in-context references. And the reason we do that is if we save this out later or do a save as later and have in-context references, it's going to take those references and make them out of context. So we want to save that name first and then start creating our references. I'll go ahead and create a new part and place it on this face, and that'll bring me into a sketch, and I'll create a circle at the center of this bore, and then I'm going to control click the circle and the circle that defines the bore and make these two coradial. And then I'll go ahead and exit the sketch. From there we'll create an extrude by clicking on the sketch, and I want this going into the part. I'll set this at 2 inches. And I'll go ahead and exit the edit component. Generally when I create parts or new parts within the assembly, I like to rename these pretty much right away and save them out externally. And once again you'll see that in context arrow next to the name of the part. Once again I'm going to create a new part, and this is going to be the crankshaft, and I'll place it on this back face. I'll go ahead and hit spacebar and go normal 2, and then I want to draw in another circle at the center of this circle, and I'll give this a dimension of 3/4 of an inch. I'll go ahead and extrude this out and just right click, do up to surface, and I'll choose that back face and click OK. From here I'm going to rename this component, make it crankshaft, and once again save this out. And then when I'm working with parts, I like the appearances to be separate and recognizable, so I generally assign different colors to the parts while I'm working. From here I'll exit out of the edit component and I'll apply a appearance to the piston. So once again I'll go back into the crankshaft part with the edit part, and I want to create a new sketch plane to draw in some features. So I'm going to go into view and say temporary axes, and I want to create a plane that's parallel to this outside face that's passing through this axis, and I'll make that parallel. That'll allow me to create a sketch at the center of this cylinder. And for that, I'm going to use the straight slot tool and draw a slot out from the center of the crankshaft onto this axis. Then I'll go ahead and control click this end and control click the circle and make these tangent. And then I'm going to give this a dimension of 1 inch. Lastly, I'll create a circle at the center of this side of the slot. And I'll give this a dimension of 1/2 inch. And before I exit the sketch, I'm going to want to reuse this sketch on the other side for the other cylinder. And I could copy and paste this sketch, but instead I'm going to use a block. And I'll do that just by highlighting over the sketch, make a new block, and that's going to use the arc and the slot, the arc being the circle, to create a block. And I'll be able to quickly insert this on the other side. So from there, I'm going to create an extrusion from the block. It's going to be mid-plane, 1.5 inches in width, and we're going to use the selected contour option. To choose out both of the contours. You'll also notice a check mark icon next to my mouse cursor. If I right click, it does the same operation as the green check mark and exits the feature. I'll go ahead and create an extruded cut as well from the same sketch. Once again, mid-plane, and in this case it's going to be 3/4 inch, and we'll go ahead and use the default contour. So if I hide out the engine block, you can see now we've removed out this section of the crankshaft and added a pin for our crank rod. Next, I'm going to go ahead and edit the piston, so I'll exit the edit component. And I'll click on the piston and go to edit part. And now we want to create a plane that passes through this axis on the piston. Once again, parallel. I could have referred to the plane 1 in the crankshaft, but there's a good reason you actually don't want to do that, because this crankshaft refers to the engine block, and then this piston would be referring to the crankshaft, which refers to the engine block, and the piston already refers to the engine block. So it may create a circular reference, which would cause problems later. So you just want to avoid creating multiple references between components that link back to that original. It's better to have those relations linked directly to the single engine block. Now that I have this plane, I'll create a sketch. And I'm going to draw a corner rectangle from one corner of the piston to the midpoint. And I'll draw in a circle coincident to that axis. Give it a dimension of 1/2 inch. and space it off from the bottom by a 1/2 inch as well. And with this sketch, we're going to create a series of cuts. So first we'll create a midplane cut of 1 inch. Then I'll create another extruded cut using the selected contours and just selecting out that inner circle. I'll set this as through all and the same in direction 2. Lastly, I'm going to use that one more time. And in this case, I'm going to set it from an offset. I know my piston has a diameter of 1.5 inches, so I'm going to offset it by that amount and make this a 1/2 inch cut. And finally, for the piston, I'm going to use the mirror tool. Choose that plane 1, and I'll choose that cut extrude. And I'll go ahead and exit edit component. So now I want a rod connecting the crankshaft and the piston. So once again, we'll insert a new part. And you'll notice if I click in and don't click on a face, it'll simply add this part into space. I'll go ahead and rename this part. Call it crank rod. And save that part out to the same file location as the assembly. Next, I'll go ahead and create a sketch on this plane. First, I just want to go into the edit component, and we'll choose that plane 1 and create a sketch. And I just want to draw a straight slot from the center of one of these arcs to the center of one of those circles. Then I'm going to use the convert entities and convert over these two circular edges. And lastly, I'll go ahead and add a width of 3/4 of an inch and create an extrusion. And we'll have a mid-plane extrusion of 1/2 of an inch. And like I like to do with all parts, I'll go ahead and quickly apply a different color. And I'll go ahead and unhide the engine block. So the last thing I need for this assembly is the same features on the other side for the other cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the crankshaft and edit the part. Once again, I'm going to create a plane, choose this axis, make it parallel, and click OK. From there, we'll create a sketch on that plane 2. And now, instead of having to draw that feature back up, we'll just go into blocks and say insert. And we have one open block since it's already in this assembly. I'll go ahead and drag this point to that center, and then I can place this in several locations In this case, I will make this edge and that edge collinear. And once again, we'll create that mid-plane extrusion of 1.5 inches off of both contours. And I'll right click to exit, and then choose that sketch again and create an extruded cut. Mid-plane and 3/4 inch. And that should complete our crankshaft. So from here I can see I have several in-place mates. These get created when you create a new part and drop that part onto a face. I'm going to go ahead and delete these out. And then I'll mate the crankshaft back in. I'll make these two cylinders concentric, and we'll make this back face and this face coincident. Now I want to mate my crank rod and the crankshaft concentric, and I want to do the same with the piston. So I'll go ahead and right click on the engine block, hide it out, make these two concentric, and lastly for these I'll add a width mate between the piston and the rod. And I'll want to go ahead and do the same on the other side. So I'll just do a control drag with the piston to bring out an extra part, and the same for the rod to bring out an extra copy of that rod. And to finish this up, we will mate this in. I'll go ahead and mate this rod concentric to this cylinder. Do the same on the other side with the piston. And we'll place the piston in concentric to the cylinder. And I'll once again hide out the engine block and use a width mate. And it looks like we're missing that concentric mate between these two. And I may have added the wrong mate. Let's see. So I'll take a look in the crankshaft, look at the mates, and that accidentally got it added as a tangent mate instead of concentric. And we can see on this side this rod is fixed, so we want to go ahead and float that. And this piston hasn't yet been mated to the engine block, so we'll go ahead and select that face, once we show the engine block, and mate these two together. And now this should move correctly. So this is just one example of how to use in-context relations and how to build a part in context. I'm not quite sure Ford is going to be lining up to buy this design, but hopefully you learned a bit from this video.